you know. It is Mr. Juna? Juna? Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. I hope I'm audible. I want to continue with tissues today. Last time we did general connective tissues, all its subvarieties, classifications, and we explained that on the basis of density, on the basis of arrangement of fibers, matrix, and cells, on the basis of the function and modification of the cells to do that function, we have classified connective tissue. Then, within connective tissue types, but already highly specialized, able to do only a particular set of functions, not able to divide back into a more generic or more pluripotent kind of cell, are two types of tissues called cartilage and bone. They are connective in nature, but they are not the general connective tissue which we classified last week. They are specialized or committed connective tissue types. They are not the original four types: epithelium, connective, muscle, and nerve. Muscle tissue also comes from mesoderm, right? So when we do embryology, you'll get a better sense of that. But for now, just remember that within connective tissue, there was a whole series or array or spectrum of generalized tissues which were densely or loosely packed, which had subtypes like adipose and reticular and embryonic. And now we're looking at subtypes which are much more specialized and actually much more voluminous in the sense of how much more they are present in the body, or how much more percentage of the body they make up. I've already talked about this with musculoskeletal system. We'll look at a little bit more of the histologic terminology. I still don't have the actual slides which you will see in the practicals. I was hoping you'll actually join us from next Monday, and then we could actually show you under the microscope what it is that we're talking about, but apparently that won't happen. So for today, I'm just keeping it brief. I'll cover these two specialized types of connective tissue to complete connective as a set. And then maybe if there's time we can also finish muscle. But it makes more sense to do it with slide pictures, because if you're not going to come to the practicals, and I actually want to show you the photomicrographs of actual slides. So I will do that from the next class. Today we'll just do it more like a generic class to remind you of what we have already done. So we were here. Last time we were here. To continue that, we said reticular tissue was the type where the majority fiber of the cell's matrix and fiber, the fibers could be collagen, elastin, or reticulin. And when reticulin is the dominant fiber in certain organs, the cells are supported by this network of reticulin, which is a specialized protein of a different type compared to collagen and elastin, and it doesn't stain distinctly with hematoxylin-mucin, so we use special stains to show it up, and usually we show it in places like the spleen or the liver, where you will see tissue. And in that network of highly metabolic organs, this rich reticular network is going to support and hold together these bunches and bunches of cells. So that's where we stopped last week. And today I want to cover cartilage and bone as a tissue. To become cartilage, a embryonic connective tissue has to start differentiating into a kind of cell which will produce a very specialized matrix of cartilage only, which is composed of large molecules called glycosaminoglycans. I don't know how much organic chemistry you have done or you remember from your plus 2, but read up a little bit about it. There is a chemical called chondroitin sulfate which is interspersed in this matrix, and there is a glycosaminoglycan set of molecules which together make up the matrix of cartilage. To lay it down as the base, we need cells which will only produce this and no other kind of matrix. These cells will be called chondrocytes. And once they start secreting this matrix all around themselves, they kind of get trapped into this space because this matrix is a semi-flexible, semi-rigid material. When we will come to bone, we'll see that the material becomes even more rigid, so rigid that the cells have no scope of doing anything except staying where they are. So you have to set in an architecture which will keep the cells alive, which means we have to provide the supplies to them, lay it down before that matrix is set into place. It's like putting the wiring into the walls before the cement of the wall sets. Okay, that's the nearest analogy I could think of. But when you're building the wall and the cement is wet, everything is still wet and fluid, is when you want to put in the pipes and the wires and the filaments and any connections, anything else you want. Because once it is set, then it is just set. Things won't move, but they have to be kept alive. They have to work. The connections have to work. So that is somewhat the challenge of creating these specialized connective tissues called cartilage and bone. Between the two, cartilage adopts one way of keeping its cells alive, and bone adopts a completely different way. In cartilage, the matrix is semi-permeable. So these molecules, though they are large aminoglycan molecules, they have enough sol, between sol and gel phases of any material. So they are sol enough to allow diffusion, percolation of very small molecules like water and ions and glucose, urea. Therefore, nutrition can be maintained through diffusion, through the matrix. So in cartilage, the matrix is such that since it permits a good amount of diffusion, those chondrocytes which are now into the spaces which they occupy, which we call lacunae, they will be kept alive from the nearest blood vessels or the capillary networks by the release of those nutrient materials which will go through and through the matrix and come to the chondrocyte. So, it is possible to lay down a slab of cartilage which has no blood vessels within it. So, in between the chondrocytes, you don't have any capillaries or veins or arteries or anything. That is a great technology to adopt because it allows that slab of cartilage to become very flexible, to become almost transparent. Cartilage that we have is called hyaline, which means glass-like cartilage. If you open up a joint, which you will do in dissection, and you take a strip of cartilage off the top of the end of the epiphysis of any bone, you can hold it up to the light and it's transparent. It's like a slab of cellophane or transparent, flexible plastic. For living cells, to be able to give that kind of a interface, where there's no impedance to light even, the visual, optic characteristics of the material. The purpose is not to be transparent. I mean, whether you're transparent or not within the body doesn't make any difference to anything. It just happens to be one of the characteristics of this particular cartilage. But the point here is that the fibers, you remember three things: the cells, fibers, and matrix. The matrix, which is cartilage matrix. The fibers, which are fibers embedded within the cartilage, and cells, which are chondrocytes, all together are dispersed so uniformly. Their optic properties are exactly the same. You can't make out one from the other. Therefore, the whole slab doesn't look particulate. It doesn't look like it's got so many things inside it. It just looks like one uniform homogeneous piece. That's the look of it. But in terms of its chemical characteristics, it permits perfusion of very small molecules. But because the cells inside of it have to stay alive, have to be kept alive, and diffusion cannot take place, across large distances, all cartilages will end up being very thin slices, flats. Right? They may take a curved shape or something, depending on the shape of the joint, but they will be very thin. That means they're not too far from a blood vessel at the edges. And perfusion, or through diffusion, even the central cells, suppose there's this much as a sheet of cartilage, right? All around are capillaries available, and through them nourishment can go into it. So the cells which are farthest from the nourishment are the cells in the middle of this slab, right? But the thickness of the slice is such that on this side there is bone on one side, especially articular cartilage in joints, and on this side is synovial fluid, especially if it is in a movable joint. Synovial fluid allows a good amount of nourishment. Bone is very vascular, very rich in blood vessels. So the epiphyseal blood vessels help to nurture this surface. So between this surface and this surface, there's always very minimal thickness, so that perfusion from both sides and from the edges can keep this cartilage alive throughout life. The fact that nature has taken this course allows cartilage to have its fabric and its ability to be completely smooth on the articular side, permitting no friction at all, right? So that the next bone can slide on it continuously to allow you all kinds of free movement. So articular cartilage, therefore, is served very well by a longer period of healing and pain and dysfunction, right? So sports injuries, whatever, cartilage tears or damage is a serious thing. And how we deal with it, we will talk about in clinical medicine. But remember, cartilage as a histological piece of tissue is classified by us further depending on the further arrangement of fibers, cells, and matrix within itself. All these three types of cartilage have the same chemical basis matrix. They have the same cells called chondrocytes. But there's a difference in the amount of fibers that it has. So the second type of cartilage we have is called fibrocartilage, which means that there is a much higher proportion of fibers than cells. So few chondrocytes, lots and lots and lots of usually collagen fibers in bundles. So because there's lots more fibers, this is no longer transparent. So it's not hyaline anymore. It looks opaque. And this is found in areas which need a lot more resilience or firmness. So it's provided as a specialized kind of cartilage in those areas which will support body weight and will need a lot of resilience. And the third kind of cartilage is available called elastic, where again there are cells, fibers, and matrix. But the type of fibers is elastin fibers more than collagen fibers. So in hyaline cartilage, we have more collagen fibers than matrix. In fibrocartilage, we have a great deal more fibers than cells. Proportion of fibers to cells is very high. And in elastic cartilage, the proportion is more or less equal to hyaline cartilage, but the type of fiber is elastin rather than collagen, which makes that slab of cartilage much more flexible, bendable, pliable. It has more recoil because the fiber has that property. And it's able to regain its shape if you distort it. So it's provided in those areas where regain of shape is an important function. So hyaline cartilage, like I've explained to you, is available mostly at the ends of long bones which participate in very mobile synovial joints. Here it is knee joint, right? Femur, tibia, and fibula. And there is the joint here is the femorotibial joint. And on both sides, it's got a slab of cartilage covering the bone. And in between, there will be a gap filled with a space called the synovial space and a fluid called the synovial fluid. That is a different story where that comes from, how it is maintained, what happens to it. But we are only looking at the tissue which is covering the bone, like a very thin strip, a thin layer, and we call it hyaline cartilage. And inside of that, the cells seem to be arranged in groups of 2 or 3 or 4, right? Together, 1, 2, 3, 4, one group, 1, 2 in a group, 1, 2, 3 in a group. So they tend to form little nests, NESTS, little cell nests of 3 to 4. This happens because the chondroblast, when it first came in and decided that this is an area where cartilage was necessary, would start secreting matrix, and some of them would become fibroblasts which lay down, they settle into their space. But when they secrete matrix around themselves, they clear out a space outside where the matrix is being secreted on all sides, 360-degree sides of the cell. And it will also, at that time, the blast cell will retain the ability to divide. So the first generation of cell which has committed itself to becoming cartilage will make 2 or 3 copies of itself which will become chondrocytes, and those one very few proportion of them will retain the ability to divide further, so that in the future, at some point of time, when if remodeling is required, they can still retain the property to make more copies of themselves, to secrete more matrix and more fibers. So these chondroblasts will become chondrocytes, and the 4 or 5 chondrocytes which are born of one chondroblast will become a nest of cells. And immediately around them, they'll have a slightly darker color matrix, and further away from them, they'll have a lighter color matrix. So this was secreted earlier, and this is being secreted newly. So the newly being secreted matrix takes a deeper stain compared to the older matrix. So you'll find slight differences in shade between the matrix, but in hyaline cartilage, you won't be able to see any fibers at all, even in a stained slide. An unstained slab to the naked eye, not microscope, to the naked eye, is transparent. It's called glass-like, right? You can't see any fibers, cells, nothing in it. If you stain it and put it under the microscope also, you can't see the fibers in it because they took general properties of the matrix itself, right? But they are there. Please remember, there are lots of fibers in here, and all of them are mostly, dominantly collagen for hyaline cartilage. So chondrocyte seems to be occupying an empty, can you see there's a white halo-like thing around the cell? That is what we are calling the lacuna. So the name is lacuna, which means empty space. But you must understand that this has happened after we have processed the cell. In nature, we don't have empty spaces, really. What looks empty must be containing some material which did not take up a stain 99.99% of the time. So when you look at tissues under the microscope, if you're seeing empty looking space, it's not because there's nothing, vacuum there. It's not even possible. There's something there, it didn't get stained. In this case, it is an artifact of the way we process the tissues. The cell occupies some space, and immediately around it, it is surrounded by matrix. But when we put the tissue through a process, we first dehydrate it, then we rehydrate it, and we stain it. This is to help fix it and take a block and take a slice and so on and so forth. We'll talk about that. What to remember is when we are dehydrating that slab of tissue, the cell will shrink, but the matrix is such that it can't change its properties at all. It just stays as it is. Cells will lose a little cytoplasm and shrink. They become dehydrated. So they shrink within the smaller than the original space they occupy. That looks like a lacuna. So these empty spaces are actually histological processing artifacts, and they're characteristic. That's how you will recognize cartilage under the microscope. Just remember the fact that we have lacuna with chondrocytes in it and that the chondrocytes are in groups of 3 or 4 called cell nests, and that their immediate surrounding matrix, what we call territorial matrix, stains a little darker, whereas the further away matrix, what we call interstitial matrix, stains a little lighter. These are 4 or 5 points by which you will identify what is this tissue, and since you know it's cartilage, what kind of cartilage it is. So please remember these points. Inside of that cell will be a nucleus. So you may be able to see a nucleus which will always take up a purple stain. Right? It is DNA which is acidic, so it will take up the basic stain, hematoxylin. Okay, it will be more purple. So you have a purple dot inside of a little pink space. That pink space may or may not be visible to you, so it may just look like purple dots. It doesn't matter. Remember, there's a cell with a nucleus, within a lacuna, within the matrix. That's how it's laid out. Hyaline cartilage is found in those areas where you need some flexibility, but you also need strong support. It is rich in collagen fibers, but you don't see them. As far as histological characteristics, microscopy characteristics go, you don't get to see any fibers, but you must never forget that they are there. Cells don't give any strength, fibers do. The rib cage and the cartilages of the trachea and bronchi of your respiratory tree are all hyaline cartilage in nature. The first thing that your bones are, before they are bones, is a cartilage model of the same bone. So if you have a femur here, in the beginning it was a cartilaginous femur. And that cartilage got completely replaced by a bony femur in a process called endochondral ossification. Endo, inside, chondral, cartilage, ossification. Right? So first you lay down a cartilage model, then the osteoblasts move in. There are clast cells which will eat away and destroy the cartilage which has been laid down, and new matrix, new fibers will be laid down by the new invading bone cells. That's how it happens. I think we talked about it in a previous class. So most of your skeleton was a cartilage model in embryo before it became a bone skeleton. Those parts of the bone which will still retain the capacity to grow will remain cartilage, and that's what we call the epiphyseal plates. And when you attain your full height, or rather when your long bones attain their complete length, that only happens when the entire cartilage has been replaced by. The second type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. We said it is rich in fibers compared to cells. So you can see again here we've used a different stain. It's not HNE. It's not the same stain we had in the earlier slide. And they particularly use a blue stain for the collagen fibers in the matrix. The cells are minimal. You hardly get to see them. But they're still chondrocytes and they're still within lacuna. The lacuna part is not so clear, but it's definitely there. The cell with nucleus part is not separated very clearly. But actually, this is the cell, this is the nucleus, and that is the lacuna around it. But the fibers here are kind of confusing the picture. In any case, you won't see it as clearly as you see it in the hyaline cartilage picture. But you see the proportion. The number of fibers are huge compared to the number of cells. And the example of it is the intervertebral disc, because it takes a lot of pounding action. It resists a lot of kilogram force throughout your life. More fibers are required to keep it more resilient and springy comparatively. Very, very tough cartilage, slightly compressible, found where there's a great deal of pressure, weight-bearing joints, such as the knee. In the knee, what we saw in the previous picture, the articular cartilage was hyaline, but there are extra pieces of cartilage called menisci, which are fibrocartilage in nature. Similarly, in the jaw, in your two temporomandibular joints, there is an articular disc which is of a fibrocartilage nature because it takes the power of the clamping of your jaw in chewing movements. And in between vertebrae, as you can see here. Elastic is the third kind of cartilage. The classic example is the pinna of the ear and the cartilages of the nose, where you can distort it. It's flexible enough, but it comes back and retains its shape. So the difference is, again, here it's a different stain, not hematoxylin eosin, where it is showing you the elastic fibers in the matrix which are You remember we said between collagen and elastin, the difference is collagen fibers are thicker, they are unbranched, and they are always in bundles. Elastin fibers are thinner, they are branched, they may be singularly spaced, and the tips, the ends of the elastin fibers tend to be curly or wavy because the molecule has that recoil property. So chondrocytes in the lacuna, enough number of cells, as many as in hyaline cartilage. Nucleus, chondrocyte, and then a space called a lacuna. They'll be in groups of 2 or 3 or 4 together. You don't get single cells. You saw in fibrocartilage, it's single far cells. They're not in nests. Whereas both in hyaline and in elastic cartilage, they'll be in groups, 2, 3, 4 cells together. And the matrix closer to the cells will be darker, the matrix further from the cells will be lighter. And if you use a special stain, you'll be able to see the elastin in between all these cells together. The kind of fiber which predominates is elastin for elastic cartilage. External ears, epiglottis in your larynx or voice box. I think we'll finish bone for the sake of completion, but it will be a separate practical. So in the practical for cartilage, you will see 3 slides of one of each type of cartilage. At that time, we will reinforce all the differentiating points and the identifying points. Bone is the same story, cells, matrix, and fibers, but their geometric arrangement is very different from cartilage. It's a hard connective tissue where there are living cells and mineralized matrix. So there is organic and inorganic elements within the tissue. The types of bone are cancellous or spongy bone and compact bone. We talked about this in the general class in musculoskeletal system. So when you're talking about the histological classification of bone, there are only 2 types, cancellous bone and compact bone. Then we are not saying long bones, short bones, irregular bones, flat bones, all that. That is a gross anatomy or morphological classification. Now we are looking at the tissue or the histological classification. There are only 2 types, cancellous or spongy bone and compact bone. Example of a cancellous bone is the sphenoid. It's an irregular bone in the skull. So if you take a small piece of sphenoid and you fix it and you process it for histological slicing, you take a thin slice, stain it, then you will see that there are lots of empty looking spaces. So in between bone is pink, and in between there's a lot of space that would have been the holes in the cancellous bone, the holes of the sponge-like bone, which will always usually contain bone marrow, active or inactive, but it will contain bone marrow. So we ignore the gaps and look at only the bone tissue which is available, and you see that there are again lacuna with cells inside of it. So you have an osteocyte, you see its nucleus, and you see that inside the material, the pink material of the bone, it tends to be in slabs, narrow rods or slabs, which is called a trabecula, right? Each extension, each finger-like or slab-like or bridge-like extension of material is called a trabecula. Inside of that, you will see several osteocytes which are within this lacuna, and in between that is the bone matrix, osseous matrix, not the cartilage or chondrocyte laid matrix, but the osteocyte laid matrix, and it seems to be somewhat amorphous and almost uniformly pink. You don't see much in terms of a pattern or a design or anything like that. And you're seeing some cells called osteoblasts, which are the pluripotent, multipotent cells, which are always on the edge of the slab. So the bone trabecula, on the edge of it will have large cells called osteoblasts, which are capable of mitosis and creating more numbers of themselves. And those daughter cells are osteocytes, which actually do the production of the matrix, production of the fibers, and whatever else is required for bone. So in a mature bone, let's say this sphenoid or any irregular bone that you take, you will see much less of osteoblasts, and you will see the cells in a kind of a random arrangement within these trabeculae of cells. In between these is the bone marrow area, which we're not going into now, which has a completely different tissue, which has got nothing to do with bone. It is not doing weight bearing, locomotion, musculoskeletal system, nothing, right? The bone marrow is a completely different tissue. It's just sitting here. It's just occupying the space and doing production of the blood cell lines. So we won't look at that today. Cancellous bone, the point is, it has same osteocytes in lacuna, it will have a few osteoblasts, it will have bony trabeculae, and it won't have anything specific in terms of architectural arrangement of these cells. Whereas when you come to compact bone, it has a very distinct, very easy to identify, very characteristic arrangement where you have a central canal and you have layers or lamellae of bone laid down in concentric circles around a few hundreds of layers. What we are seeing here at this magnification is 240x. This is one layer, outside of that is the next layer, outside of that this is the third layer, outside of that this is the fourth layer, 4 or 5 layers which make up one set. So these 4 or 5 lamellae, lamella is a Latin or Greek or something for layer. So these 4 or 5 layers of osteocytes in a concentric pattern around a singular central canal is a characteristic of compact bone. Now in this particular slide there is no stain because this is what is called a ground section. We've taken a bone, we have held, let's say a long bone, we held it on its long axis and we have ground it. We've, like you do grinding of a knife, right? We have ground it against a hard metallic surface or something like that, so that we have worn it down into a very, very thin slice. We have not stained it or anything. We have dusted it off and put it directly under the microscope just to be able to see this architecture. That's why it looks black, with all the dust of what you ground off is occupying the spaces. So actually there are no cells there. The space which the cell has had occupied in life is available there, looks black because of the dust in it. And this lacuna would have had an osteocyte in life, right? This is a live bone slice with staining. Therefore, we are calling it osteocyte and osteoblast and whatever here. Here we don't call it anything because the cells are not there. But you're seeing the architecture of the space where the cells used to be when they are alive. And the matrix is organized into lamina. And the matrix is ossified matrix, right? Which has organic material, which is the chemical compound which makes up the matrix of bone. So homework is, I had mentioned glycosamine or glycans and chondroitin sulfate for cartilage matrix. For bone matrix, what is the chemistry? What molecules make up bone matrix? Alright, and of course there will be a bone component chemical, which I think all of you know, calcium and phosphate and hydroxyapatite are the compound molecules which are what makes bone the rigid structure that it is, right? So there is an inorganic component of molecules and there is an organic component of molecules together which constitute bone matrix. Homework is find out about it. What you see in histology or anatomy is the net result because of that kind of matrix, because of this arrangement of lamella, because of this laying down of spaces of osteocytes. A transverse section, TS of compact bone, will look like this. And one set of lamellae with all its cells and its intercellular connections together forming an ovoid system, which you have taken a TS of it. So actually this system is a cylinder which you've cut through. So this whole cylinder of interconnected lacunae connected to or leading up to one central canal is called an osteon. One osteon is served by one arteriole within the bone. So this is a space which used to be occupied by a living artery and vein. And its branches would get into these really tiny branch-like gaps to get from here to this cell and to this cell and to this cell and to this cell. You have to leave a space because otherwise the matrix is completely hardened. It's ossified. So very fine capillary branches will be filling up these ray-like interconnections in between these lamellae of matrix, between the rows of lacunae which contain the osteocytes of each osteon. These very fine channels are called canaliculi. So the big channel is called central canal, and all the tiny channels are called canaliculi. Lacunae, canaliculi, lamellae. Right? And this particular arrangement is only seen in bone and nowhere else. So it's a very easy slide to identify. Right? Can't mistake this tissue for anything else. It looks like the bark of the cut section of a tree. Surprising how much matching there is between botanical systems and zoological systems. Quite fascinating. We must do a discussion on that sometime. Okay, so when you take a long bone, this is a short long bone, you grind it down and you look at a TS and a microscope, what you will see is this typical system, which is called a Haversian system. It was named by, I think, a Dutch doctor, De Havers or something his name was. So forever we honor him by naming it the Haversian system of arrangement of osteocytes around the vasculature which supplies the compact part of bone. Cancellous part of bone doesn't seem to have any kind of a system. There must be some vessel somewhere. It's not there in this particular slide, but there must be access to some blood vessel somewhere. We will look at that later. You concentrate on compact bone because that's the majority bone that you have. Okay, I'll just run through blood because that's not part of what you see in an ad, but you will see in great detail in physiology. There are red blood cells and white blood cells. They will look like that in a peripheral smear. You take a drop of blood, put it on a slide, and you smear it, you stain it with ginseng, and that's how you will see it. The matrix, like I mentioned before, is liquid flowing matrix called plasma. There is hemopoietic tissue which forms blood cells found in the bone marrow, which is divided into yellow and red bone marrow. That was there in the previous slide, not here. Hemopoietic tissue is different from blood. Bone marrow contains this hemopoietic tissue. So cancellous bone, now this is at the end of a long bone. This is not like sphenoid, right? This is like a long compact bone. The compact bone is here in the sides of the diaphysis, the thickness of the diaphysis. Whereas in the epiphysis and metaphysis regions, you have these holes, and in that you get a whole lot of progenitor cells, blast mother cells, which are destined to become RBC, WBC, platelets, and so on, and there'll be a lot of fat, and so on and so forth. We're not looking at bone marrow today. Next would be muscle. We'll come to that next week. You revise in your atlas, histology atlas and histology textbooks, whatever you have. Please read up cartilage and bone. If you raise any doubts, I'll answer them next week. Otherwise, we will move on to the third basic kind of tissue, which is muscle tissue. Okay, bye for now.